Welcome everybody, and thank you for your precious time to come and help us celebrate our 10th Green Building Week event. We've got a panel today which we've brought together to talk about a retrofit of buildings, a selection of people involved in that process. We've got Dan Higginson, Director at Greycoat, the money people, the people that come and make these buildings happen, find funding, engage us consultants to help them scope these projects. Robin's going to talk to us about the physics, the engineering that goes behind decarbonising these existing assets. Gemma, an associate with us at Cundall, is going to talk about the sort of structural issues around reusing of buildings and how that's an important part of the process as well. And JJ, Director at Lorraine Architects, is going to talk to us about how we make these fantastic places that people want to spend their time, especially now post-COVID. The workplace is somewhere we want to spend time, not sitting in our living rooms. So a couple of observations from me around where we're at with this. And so I've been designing low-energy buildings for 20, 30 years, my whole career, one way or another. So I've always been interested in how we use energy in buildings and how they work. But I've also become increasingly aware of their impact on the high, kind of global planet. And it's interesting that, you know, we hear of days in the UK when the country's been entirely powered by renewables, which sounds fantastic. And we celebrate that, and no one would have ever thought we'd get to that position. But if we look at energy consumption by source in the UK, we still see that renewables is a very small part, the diagram on the left. Top left, it's the orange upwards, are the renewables of our total energy consumption by source. And then if you look at the diagram on the right, which is global renewable energy generation, you can see that, you know, at 2020, we're still at the sort of midpoint of that graph, and there's a lot of work to do to get the amount of renewable energy that we require to power our future in a net zero way. So there's still a lot of work to do despite all that good news around what we can do. And I guess also reflecting on carbon emissions, and we seem to be a little bit stuck in a consumption-based model which relies on growth, which relies on increasing consumption of fossil fuels. And we see what's now being called the production gap, which is the gap between the amount of fossil fuels we're intending to extract and the amount we should extract to meet our climate targets. And at the moment, those that know say that we're planning to extract over twice what we should be extracting to meet our 1.5 degrees C climate targets. So we're sort of still heading in the wrong way. And we can see that our consumption, our use of fossil fuels is continuing to climb at a steady rate despite all this fantastic renewables that we're putting in, which means we're obviously growing faster than we're decarbonising. And you can see a fantastic little blip in there, which unfortunately was a pandemic. And you know, if that's the only way we're going to make some reduction in it, that's a bit of a shame. We need to find another way of having such a massive impact on this consumption. Because what happens is that those fossil fuels that we extract end up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And this is a plot of carbon dioxide over the years from back in early 2000 to nearly today. And you know, there is no real reduction. It doesn't take too much of a scientific mind to see the trajectory of that curve. It's not going anywhere, it's not turning right, it's not turning down, it's not going anywhere because we're continuing to consume the fossil fuels. So we have a bit of a challenge really around consumption. And these are the curves that we've been looking at, and the commitments are fantastic, and they show wonderful results if you can commit to the decarbonisation that you need. But look at that sharp turn at the top that's required to get us down on the 1.5 trajectory, which we can see we're already beginning to exceed. And something significant has to happen up there. And it's demand reduction. We need to stop using this stuff. And I think that's what I think is interesting about buildings, because if buildings are 40% of this carbon and we can decarbonise them, we know how to decarbonise them, we can play a really significant role in the reduction the use of fossil fuels, which therefore will be a reduction in atmospheric CO2 levels. So I'm excited by our ability and our opportunity to actually make a difference and to get that graph turning. There's lots of other things we need to do. I won't start talking about all the other emissions and transport emissions and other things, but we as the built environment have an opportunity to do something really significant here. Let's get into a little bit more detail around the subject. Panel presentations. I'd like to invite Dan Higginson to come up and give us his thoughts around the world of retrofit and how that works for Greycoat.
Thanks, Julian. So for those that don't know Greycoat, we're a development and asset management business. We invest alongside our capital partners to deliver what we think are high quality office projects in London. Over the last 10 years or so, our focus has really been on refurbishment and repositioning. That's everything from back to frame, remodelling and extension, all the way through to working with existing occupied buildings. I have to say that's not because we're really clever or smug or because we can predict the future, but it suits our business model and it suits the business model of our investment partners. I think it's important to say we've not abandoned ground-up development, and actually I'm a big believer that the sort of narrative around, you know, new development bad, refurbishment good is pretty binary and quite unhelpful actually. But I think, you know, we can all agree that recycling a building in its simplest form has to be the right starting point. And with advances in technology and what we know, the ability to reduce the operational needs of any building over time is only improving. So Julian asked me specifically to talk about what the investment drivers were for us in the projects that we're working on. In the wider sense, it's about liquidity. We want to create the best building we can that will allow us to lease it on the best possible terms, and guess what, create the most value. So awkward truth number one, it's about the money that we can generate from every project. Not exclusively, but it's important. To us, what defines grade A or best in class? Over the years that's changed, and building to building it changes. It could be location, it could be specification, natural light, amenity, and we see the environmental credentials of that building, or ESG as it likes to get lumped in with, particularly by the agents, as being an increasingly important part of that rich mix. I think it's fair to say that we are gradually seeing an increased focus from occupiers on what they perceived to be a good building. If you assume that it ticks the boxes in terms of where they want to be in the physical space, they're a lot more focused on what does this building say about our business, what does it say to our clients, what does it say to our staff. In some cases, is it good enough simply to get our staff back into the office and out of their off their kitchen tables? And importantly, the corporate goals that those businesses have changed dramatically over the last 5 years, and probably include some form of fairly bold statements about net zero or some form of environmental target. You know, typically businesses are adopting the 2030 target to be net zero. That's particularly interesting for us because we think that the number of buildings that would be able to operate in that manner is in the minority, and therefore going forward, as people need to shift their real estate to accommodate these goals, therein lies the opportunity. But therein also lies a big disconnect in the market as far as we can see, because there's a lot of people that have given themselves some quite heady targets with absolutely no regard as to how they're going to get there. It's kind of like writing yourself a to-do list and patting yourself on the back and saying, you know, great, I've achieved a lot today. And I think there's going to be a realisation as they approach 2030 that real estate in particular is a large part of their ability to meet their targets, and they haven't done anything about it. As an industry, we've been very focused on point-in-time targets. What's your BREEAM rating? What's your EPC rating? And it's a model whereby developers come along, they give you a building that meets a certain criteria, then everyone goes, brilliant, we've ticked that box, let's move on. And actually, we're moving towards a model that, you know, frankly, we're interested in BREEAM and EPC so far as we need to tick that box, that's it. As Julian will tell you, we're far more focused on the energy demands of the building and what the embodied carbon is in particular, that's the bit that we spend the time worrying about. And actually, you know, we're certainly of the view that in due course the market will move towards more of a whole life carbon model, which is a much fairer benchmark to model new build and refurbishment projects. I'm always amused by, you know, big bold statements from developers that just delivered 7 million square feet of new build and on day 2 say we're net zero carbon. Great, you know, and then the market buys into it at the moment, which is in some ways not right. My key view here is that there has to be a shift in mindset across the industry. I think as developers we need to be better at giving occupiers in particular the tools to do the job. I think consultants need to work harder to push their clients and their occupier clients in particular to embrace some of the technologies and some of the thinking that the likes of Cundall have embedded within their business. And also that, you know, the agency community and the valuation community needs to get behind what actually creates value, because part of the challenge we have when I'm talking to my investment partners, say, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, how much value does that create? It's almost impossible to tell them today that if you go to an all-electric building or you reduce your energy from this to this, that you're going to get another £2 a foot on your rent, or the yield's going to move in, or whatever it's going to be. It's almost impossible to prove. This is my one slide that I gave Julian with 2 buildings on it. I chose these because they're quite different. Building on the left, Sterling Square. It's a refurb that we're doing around an occupied building. We've got Citibank in there who, you know, if you drop a spanner in the basement, you'll get a phone call to say, can you keep the noise down? You've got BAE, who are probably the most secretive business I've ever encountered in a building. But we are taking that building on a journey to net zero. And I think that's my first point, that this is you've got to view this stuff as a process. If you assume you can do it all on day one, you'll probably fail, unless you've got a completely vacant building and a reasonably good budget. But all of this stuff is a journey, it's a process. And by that I mean you've got to work around what your existing occupiers, the people who are actually paying you rent, want to do. But also as an industry, we're all learning. You know, there aren't that many data points at the moment, unlike other areas of our industry. Technology is improving. You know, there might be something that you'd like to do today but you can't, but there's a good chance you'll be able to do it tomorrow. I know JJ is going to talk about this, but perfection is absolutely the enemy of the good when it comes to refurbishment. Refurbishments are always a compromise, whether it's physical, financial, time, planning, whatever it might be. It's always a compromise. So being able to prioritise what you do is pretty important. The building on the right is 15 Suffolk Street, which is a relatively small building for us, but it's important because it's where Greycoat are going to relocate to. And I think this is one of those buildings where lots of assumptions about things that we thought might make a difference didn't, and other things that we didn't think would make much of a difference have. You know, if I counted up the number of hours that Julian and I have debated, let's call it a debate for the moment, whether we insulate the rear elevation of that building and the impact that it has, it'd be quite a lengthy discussion, wouldn't it, Julian, to be fair to say. And that's a good example where you have to step back and say, actually, it does have a big impact in how the building performs when you look at the energy modelling. Is it expensive? Yes, in the scheme of it. But I think Julian's words are along the lines of, look, if you're going to do this, let's do it properly. Why are you scrimping on the last, whatever it is, pounds per square foot, when this will start to move the dial for the building that you're working in? And it's that sort of dialogue that I think you need to be having with your clients or with your teams or whatever it might be. And then I think back to my point about sort of reuse good and redevelopment bad, I think everyone needs to think about these things in context. There's no point retaining a existing building that's rubbish, because an empty building is not worth anything to anybody. But similarly, there's lots of other things at play. Heritage aspects. There's the townscape, planning considerations, public realm, site utilisation, all this kind of stuff that we need to think about. So I think therein ends my comments for the moment. My time and moment. Some of the things that we've taken on board as we've done a number of these projects over time.
Right. Robin, your chance to wow us with a bit of physics, and again some projects that we've been working on to help the audience understand what this is all about. Over to you.
I guess just start off, it's probably good defining what we mean by net zero carbon in practice. So obviously you've got demand reduction at the top of the curve and an increase in renewables to get to the point where our building demands meet our renewable energy generation. So that's net zero carbon. We're seeing a lot of drivers for this across government, industry, various schemes around CREM that we'll touch on in a bit, and we've started to see sort of a net zero carbon building standards from the industry as well. That's a new one on us. So at Cundall we've adopted a sort of a 7 steps approach to net zero carbon. So passive design, reduce operational energy, eliminate fossil fuels, look at renewables, and then the life cycle carbon impacts. So embodied carbon, the life cycle, and public disclosure. And so telling people what you're doing, being public about it, is a key item. So this is a sort of idealised net zero carbon waterfall where we start to make improvements to existing buildings. So you've got, ideally facade replacement, optimise your building, reduce your loads, and then look at the MEP side of things, so lighting, heating, ventilation, and then on to some of the, the slightly newer things around tenant adaptations and BCO loads, behaviour change, what people are willing to accept in their buildings, changes in temperatures, etc. Now, facade replacement, when we look at embodied carbon, isn't always viable. We're seeing a lot of buildings in London, 20 years old, coming up to their first MEP refit, where stripping the facade and starting again just doesn't have a life cycle payback for carbon. So we have to sort of take an MEP first approach. So again, optimising all the systems, doing what we can now, and then looking to the future for facade replacements, improvements that we can do that aren't going to negatively impact the building going forward. So there are some gaps to fill at later dates, but as Dan said, don't let perfect be the sort of the enemy of good. I think the important bit we touched on with Julian is sort of the cost of inaction. The more we see global emissions going up and the longer it takes us to actually do something about it, the steeper the reduction curves get. I think that shows you another 9 years and it's a vertical drop in the emissions that we need. So we need to be doing things now, even if they're not going to be perfect and get us all the way. They're a start. We've gone through this on a recent project. This is Palm House at Kew, so this is a listed building. It's a very big greenhouse, basically, that's heated to 30 degrees. It's got rare and special plants. The only instance of the plant in the world is held in this site. Keeping it going is very important. The conditions inside are very important, but it's using a horrendous amount of energy. There isn't actually a specific, carbon reduction curve for glass houses. You'll see them for offices, for residential, schools even, but for some reason people haven't looked at glass houses yet. So we had to develop a project-specific trajectory for what we were looking at to meet the 1.5 degrees science-based target. So we worked with them, plotted it off, and came up with a reduction curve that meets a carbon budget for the job. So I think the thing when you look at these curves, are that each year is your carbon emissions. If you go beyond that curve, you need to take that carbon emission and save it below the curve at a later date. What you end up with is a project-specific budget. You've got a certain finite amount of carbon that you can emit. When you do it is important. So we developed the project budget, and then we looked at our intervention. So early doors, in the first few years, still got high energy use. We start to look at where we put our interventions into it, and we sort of bring our emissions back below the cumulative curve. The key to this is when we actually do those. So, even moving it forward by 2 years and delaying some of the interventions means that you've emitted so much carbon in those 2 years, you can't get back under that curve. So your chances of being net zero carbon over the course of your building's life are gone. So, the cost of inaction is we demonstrated on this that you need to be doing these things now, even if they're not perfect. Another job we've worked on is the Chinese embassy in London. So that's underway at the moment. This is a mix of heritage assets where we've managed to improve facades. We've got a mix of new build in there, we've retained structures, so trying to, again, maximise the benefit that we can. I think we've found, historically English heritage and some of the heritage bodies have been resistant to facade improvements. I think we're starting to see them now actually ask questions about it and push for it on projects. So, on this they were happy with facade improvements, looking to, improve the demand side of things. There's, fifth generation heat loops going into this, and technology's playing its part, but the passive design and the optimisation is there as well. And another project we're doing is 10 Piccadilly, again, heritage asset, listed building, and again, English heritage, and the people involved, the planners, are now considering and actually pushing for things like double glazing, facade improvements. They're no longer sat there saying, don't touch the facade, don't make those improvements. So we are seeing a change in how people respond to it. So that's going to feed through at later dates into behaviour change in buildings and how we interact with our assets. So I think the whole thrust of my point on this is we need to be doing things soon. They may not be perfect, but they're better than nothing. And the cost of inaction is 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees.
Hi everyone. So it sounds like everybody knows the statistic about 40% of global greenhouse emissions coming from the built environment, and those emissions are made up of embodied carbon and operational carbon. So embodied carbon being that comes from the raw materials, the processing, the transport, the construction, the meat of the building and the stuff that goes inside it, and operational carbon being the running of the building, so heating, ventilation, lighting. This diagram shows the axis of time as well. So total carbon is reducing. That's great, the circle's getting smaller, but the split between operational and embodied is changing as we shift away from gas in buildings and we have on-site renewables and kit is just generally getting more efficient. It's shifting towards us as structural engineers to decrease our contribution as well as the proportion is changing. So we often say that in terms of embodied carbon, the most sustainable building is the one that you don't build. Obviously, that's not going to happen for us as an industry, as a society. So the next best thing is the building you've already built, which is where retrofit comes in. It would be great if we could retrofit everything. It would be great if we could just chop out low-bearing walls, add new floors and do whatever we like, but gravity is still gravity, and post-war concrete in particular is still a problem. This is a building we looked at 5 or 6 years ago, which had been granted planning permission for 2 extra stories on top before we were invited in to have a look at it. It's a concrete frame from the 1950s, and it's cracked, and it's leaking, and it's got structural movements, and it's 70 years old. It's beyond the end of its design working life, and really it shows. It's also a deceptively complicated building. It looks pretty standard from the front, but the back wall of it is built off the retaining walls that support the open cut part of the district line. And I can't point from here, but just under the foundations is a Bakerloo line tunnel. So putting 2 additional stories onto it and putting additional loading through those foundations, which sit on somebody else's quite sensitive assets, was just not something we could see working, even in a building that was in good condition in the first place. And maybe if we replace the gas systems and we put in some new windows and we repair some of the leaks, it could do another 5 years maybe, but it's not going to do another 70, that's for sure. And that, I think, is quite a good case where a new lightweight building might be more suitable for the constraints in the ground and for the long term. But the big point really about this one is the importance of early investigations and making sure that what we're proposing is suitable for the building that we're trying to put it into. Some buildings we can't demolish, and nor should we want to. Listed buildings often not really about carbon, it's about the history, it's about the beauty, and we have to be really responsive in our design to create a space that we can use in a more modern way inside a historic building. These pictures are of 11 and 12 Floral Street in Covent Garden, which is partly Grade 2 listed. Obviously that picture in the middle where we smashed up a wall and put in big box frames was not the listed part, but the timber trusses at the bottom that we restored and refurbished are. So we did loads and loads of opening up works during the early stages, which not only helps us to understand if the intended scheme is feasible at all, but the earlier we know what we're dealing with, the earlier we can start to get some certainty on costs and on programme, and make sure that we're not just going to spend the whole budget on repairing what's there already. This one started out life as a warehouse, and just before we got hold of it, it was being used as a sanctuary spa. So it had pools of water and tiny little treatment rooms, which is a very different use to what it was originally intended for, and very different to what we were doing to it, which was retail and offices. And that's really important when it comes to repurposing buildings, is understanding what they were previously used for, the previous loading. So we could be pretty confident that something that had supported a metre of water in a bathing pool was going to be fine with some shop fittings on it. But it's really when you're going the other way that you have to be a lot more careful. So if we know that we're increasing the load on something, like if we're putting in a gym or some sort of roof terrace, we need to find as much record information as we can. And then we can work with measurements from site and with data on historical materials to really calculate what the floor can or can't support. And there will always be surprises along the way. In this building, we found a wall that didn't have any foundations. It was quite happily just hanging out, but it did need rectifying. And you can never ever predict what people will have thought was a sensible thing to have done to a building over the course of 150 years. But if we can reduce that contingency to a reasonable level and make sure that the surprises we do find aren't game changers, then the early interventions are worth it. Sometimes we do like to show off with a dramatic retrofit and do structural interventions that will massively increase the value of the site. So those at the top were the red sheds at Canary Wharf. They were 2 to 4 story office buildings that were sitting on a platform built out in the middle dock in the water on marine piles. And they demolished them sometime before we got involved. And the platform was empty, and they started doing the One Bank Street development behind it, and it's right in front of the tube station. It was a bit of an eyesore. And Canary Wharf abhors a vacuum, so they wanted to do something with that space. And the first question was, well, what can it hold? So we were able to justify almost doubling the loading on those piles and put in this 6-story private members club, which is a massive, massive increase in what was on the site already. Again, it was only possible because of the early investigation works that we did and the record information that we held. And that part is really unusual in that we had a full set of construction drawings, we had the notebooks from the resident engineer on site at the time, we had hand-drawn graphs of the pile load testing, we had site photos, and we even had the resident engineer still working in the office 30 years later, and he remembered it, which was helpful. So as well as that, the Bank Street site behind had been mostly demolished, but they'd left the piles sticking up out of the dock water. And that was really helpful because they had been built at the same time, the same concrete, the same method, they were sitting in the same sort of water. So we were able to do destructive testing on those to check that not only what had been built, but the condition that was left after 30 years would satisfy the capacities that we were calculating were what was really there. So I think this really shows the importance of as-built information. You can push something a lot harder when you have much more certainty about the structure that you're working with. And it shouldn't be such an unusual occurrence to have a full set of drawings for a building, but it really is. The amount of council archive offices that have had floods and fires and things have got lost in the move. And we saw the statistic earlier that Julian told us that 80% of buildings that will be standing in 25 years' time have already been built. So we have in hand all the information that we need to retrofit those in 25 years' time. We just need not to lose it. And in theory, BIM should help with that. If you actually have really useful information in your model, like material capacities and testing and certificates, as well as the physical form of it, it should be incredibly valuable. So retrofit should be the first option, but it's not always going to be the only option. Sometimes marginal gains are enough, small improvements that might not be very exciting for us as structural engineers, but do help. Early investigations are so critical so that we know what we're working with. And what we're doing has to be suitable for the building that it goes into. We've talked about compromise. We can always do something. It might not be what we first thought, but we can always make a difference.
Good morning, everyone. My name is JJ, Lorraine. I'm going to talk you through some of the challenges that we're facing as a practice in terms of these issues. This is a vast subject. I'm going to focus really on who we are as a practice, our approach, and some case studies of our projects. That's the format for the presentation. And what I'd like to start by saying is that we're trying to meet the needs of today without damaging the needs of the future. And as has been evidenced today, when we contextualize the situation that we're working in, where we have floods, hot summers, etc., there's a real case for us all, engineers, developers, consultants, clients, taking responsibility for these challenges. So we founded the practice about 13 years ago. We are 30 architects. We're lucky to work for some really good clients who care about the environment, who care about people, who also care about prosperity. And we align ourselves with a number of organizations who care about similar things. This quote, attributed to a former president of the AIA, that is the mantra that we adopt as the practice. These are a selection of the schemes that we're currently working on or have completed, and try and do more with less. We try and always look at the found condition. What exists and what can we use that is already there? And that, in terms of embodied carbon, always starts with the frame and the substructure. What is there and what is its capacity? At every RIBA work stage, we try to bring these 6 design principles to bear. So we're constantly reviewing our opportunities to advocate these principles to people we're working with, to our clients, to stakeholders, to English heritage and other people that are associated with the work that we do. But it's also an opportunity to learn from others and improve how we work as architects. It's quite easy to be overwhelmed when we look at the statistics and the graphs at really the scale of the challenge and the urgency of the challenge. And so we, as a practice, believe that a life spent in good company is a life well lived. And the photograph on the right is a really tiny initiative to plant some trees. This is in Sussex. These are sessile oaks that have a lifespan of up to 300 years when they're planted. It's actually a really tiny initiative, but by bringing people together, it actually has a bigger effect. I think collectively we're going to be much better off if we work together on these challenges. What do clients want? We think that aligning our approach with the conscious commerce that clients, investors and occupiers require is going to stand us in good stead, aligning our aims, our targets and ambitions, and to imagine ourselves as good ancestors, and to try and think more longer term. So I'm going to make a book recommendation, The Good Ancestors. So this is the book that our children's children will thank us for reading. So as has been evidenced, there is an opportunity to think about our planet and our place in it far into the future. So how do we do that? Well, these are obviously the basics, the absolute basics that, in particular, office building, something that the practice does most of. But what's interesting is that post-pandemic and the introduction and prevalence of hybrid working, what we're seeing is that there's a continuous need to innovate, to adapt, to refine what we're doing, to enhance how we approach our work, to bring some of these characteristics to bear within the buildings that we design. I'm very lucky to work with a very talented team. This is a sketch from one of my colleagues, and it kind of starts to hint at some of the things that become more important when designing these buildings. The idea of community, of knowledge sharing, the idea of the kind of social aspects of the workplace. So what do we all want? Well, a happy life. That's what we're all seeking. And I think some of these characteristics, working with the stakeholders and collaborating with each other, is going to give us a very good chance of addressing the challenges of the climate emergency. The role of the architect is to facilitate this change where there is often a vacuum of leadership and from government, or a vacuum in terms of the policy. So onto those 6 principles, and by way of talking about those in the context of case studies, this is 88 Wood Street, and we've approached this retrofit bringing these 3 core characteristics: social, mindfulness, and physical together, with a series of pavilions that are either places to sit and chat, places to shower and change for active travel, and places to sit and do concentrated work, all set against a beautiful green wall that absorbs about 140 to 150 kilograms of CO2 out of this reception space on an annual basis. Life can be tough, and life can from time to time not be fair. So let's try and make it fun. Let's try and take time to enjoy where we are. And we brought that thinking to The Fold in Croydon, which is a build-to-rent project the building designed by AHMM architects for Hub, and our practice was responsible for all the community spaces. So we brought this idea of playfulness, joy, beauty, community to these spaces. This is the building that we're doing in Victoria, and this is a really tricky building. We've spoken about working in buildings that are occupied. So the image on the top right, that is 200,000 square foot buildings, both of which are occupied, onto the top of which we're adding 107,000 square foot of net space above a fully functioning, fully operational mainline station. So it's super challenging, super interesting, but gives us the opportunity to reuse the frame and to provide an all-electric system, to look to improve the public realm, create additional NIA, introduce new technologies, and focus on green, brown, and blue roofs. In terms of longevity, this is a building in King's Cross. You can see what it's like on the right there, and it gives us the opportunity through the retrofit to do all the things that we're all focused on doing, reducing carbon both from an operational and embodied perspective, and to do that through the introduction of PVs, openable windows, through providing a flexibility of layout to future-proof these buildings, but also to give the opportunity to contribute back to the city, to take a building which is really poor and create something which is much better. So well-being, we work for the Great Estates. This is for the Howard de Walden Estate, and 2 of their buildings, the marriage of historic architecture with contemporary architecture. Well-being is about good volumes of fresh air. It's about active travel. It's about planting. It's about flexibility, but it's also about light and volume and drama and beauty. Circularity to finish with. This is Great Marlborough Street. It's a small building in Soho where we've looked to recycle the timber, we've reused the steel, planted facades, and it's a small site, but it has big ambition. It talks to long-term thinking, something that we all have a stake in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JJ. Time is ticking along, so what we'll do is I might just pose one question to the panel to get the ball rolling, and then we'll go up into audience questions. So as a starter for 10 to the panel, I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this question, but what do we see the role of government playing here? What is it doing to support retrofit, or are there barriers in the way? Is there something that government could do to help, you know, unlock things? And I guess maybe Dan, you might have some thoughts around the sort of economic side of it, and then if anyone else has got any thoughts around that.
Well, I think there's 2 elements. One is the planning arena, you know, and I think you can already see across central London anyway, huge resistance to redeveloping 20-year-old buildings that, you know, are frankly fine, but people lack the imagination to reuse. I think the second thing it'll have to be probably tariffs, taxation, something, because, you know, kind of as we've seen, people need to feel this stuff, I think, in their pockets. You know, it's taken a war in Ukraine and soaring energy prices for most people to realise that the energy that comes into their homes is not free, and that there is a wider cost to it as well. So, unfortunately, there'll have to be some form of intervention. You know, we don't have a particularly interventionist government in this country, but I think they'll have to, how it's measured, I don't know, but there'll have to be some form of cost to carbon emissions going forward. Otherwise, I just don't think relying on people, and, you know, the subtext there is developers, I suppose, relying on them to do the right thing because it's, you know, they have the best sort of philanthropic motivations, I don't think is not going to happen quickly enough.
Yeah, super. Thanks, JJ. Did you want to?
I just on picking up on Dan's point, we're all marking our own homework. You know, there is a vacuum, and that government is not doing enough. There are a few glimmers there, and a couple of things that you may have seen in the press recently. In Europe, the German authorities kind of storming the offices of DWS to get hold of computers and paperwork because of overinflated claims about their ESG credentials. So there's a kind of mis-selling aspect there, and that has been reflected also in what's happened in this country with Boohoo and ASOS, two fast retailers who make claims about sustainable fashion and are doing very well from it, because clearly consumers demand that from their purchases, and have, you know, been called out for greenwashing. So I think if there's, you know, to Dan's point, if there's a bit more, if there's more teeth from a statutory perspective on this, that is going to focus minds, and there needs to be more accountability.
This is probably also coming from the government that buys more Russian gas than anyone else in Europe, you know, still hugely dependent on fossil fuels. So, you know, I think, back to my point about mindset, really, you know, we can't go on with a scenario where renewable energies are, you know, guided by the fact that someone doesn't want to be able to see a wind turbine from their kitchen window. You know, there's going to be some, you know, there's got to be some big moves from government to lead, you know, to lead from the front in terms of how this stuff works.
I think the carbon cost and actually having that enshrined somewhere is an interesting one. The UK government in their Green Book, you know, has £220 a tonne as a central case scenario when they're looking at their policy decisions and their impacts, but we're not seeing that feed through to the sort of the level the client will see. So when we're discussing changes with clients and they're looking at, you know, there's a capital outlay, you know, what is the payback period for my energy saving? You know, it doesn't always stack up, and, you know, trying to price carbon in the future and actually having some clear direction of where they're going to go. You know, even if they say we're not doing it in the next year or two, but within 5 years, 10 years, we're going to have this carbon price, or we're going to be looking at a policy, so there's some cost certainty for clients to make a decision, because these aren't, you know, instant judgments. These are, you know, long-term investment decisions, and having that clarity around policy would be, I think, where it would help. I mean, some of it's going to be, you know, set off track slightly by things like Ukraine, but, you know, as Dan said, energy does have a cost to it, and it is sort of coming home to roost as to how dependent we are on not only, you know, Russian gas and oil, but other parts of the world, and actually, you know, driving a bit more on the renewable side as well. So hitting it from both sides, demand reduction and renewable generation.
Yeah, certainly it's a big interconnected challenge, isn't it? Yeah. So let's go to the audience and see if we can drive the debate a little bit harder. Anyone got a question for the panel?
I was very interested in what JJ had to say and what some of the other panel members had to say about circularity and the role that can play. So my question to the panel is, do you think that the tools in the markets exist at the moment to make circularity scalable up to major developments? Because I think the examples you gave, JJ, were a fairly modest scale, which is great, but do you think it's possible currently to scale that kind of approach?
You're right, the circularity market seems really like a cottage industry at the moment, but there are huge opportunities there. You could imagine if Amazon or eBay, Google said, right, we're going to take some leadership on this and catalog what's available, so that when we're designing, we can easily find all of the material properties that we need, the life, how much life is left in equipment. If anyone's ever tried on a domestic level to build anything from reused materials, it's really hard to kind of patch it all together. So I think there isn't really anything at the moment. There are kind of glimmers of it. There are some developers that are establishing materials banks and material passports and starting to kind of geotag their information, their building materials that get built on a site, so that they can be deconstructed and remade. But you're right, it's the glimmers, but one would think how much is spent in terms of building materials, it's a huge opportunity for someone, and maybe in terms of the challenges that we face, that opportunity will be taken up, and it will actually help us reduce the amount of carbon that we spend.
Yeah, I think if you had a marketplace for it, essentially.
Yeah.
But again, that's somewhere government could help. If there was a certain process you had to go through before, legally, before removing anything off of an existing site, then I think things would change quite quickly. There's lots of intrinsic benefits as well. If you're not bringing aluminium all the way from South America, you're bringing it from 3 streets away. It must make sense, and just because it's hard, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, by the way. But it is.
But you think of all of the jobs that could be created, the economy, the university degrees that haven't even been invented yet, that could all be focused on that marketplace. So if there's that kind of leadership from government that could really get behind learning and knowledge and trying to create something like that, create the environment for it to flourish, then circularity could become something meaningful rather than really piecemeal as it is.
I mean, structures, I suppose, is the big one. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason that you can't reuse 20-year-old steel that's been taken down. It takes quite a while for steel to degrade, and it's definitely usable. Part of it comes down to, like you were saying, about record keeping. If you can have maybe your mill certificates are attached to your BIM model, then you have much more certainty about what's there. But there's a problem with storage as well. I guess that if you've taken down an entire building, it has to live somewhere until it finds its new home. And I think we had a chat just earlier, someone in the audience there, about if there's a contractor or a client who works across many sites, then they're much more likely to find that something is being taken down in one place that they can put somewhere else. It's more difficult for individual smaller projects to find the materials, but they are there.
Yes, it's very much a supply and demand thing. I mean, I remember going back to the legacy of London 2012, actually, where they worked quite hard to create some circularity around some of the main infrastructure materials, and it was really difficult, but they had a very big project, so they were able to do it. But whether that's continued through, I don't know. Okay, and another question from the audience?
Cundall's example, your graphs indicated that in 27, 28 there was going to be an intervention that would drop things down. I was just curious as to what you were going to do.
So what they were looking at the moment, it's existing gas-fired boilers, and radiators sized on high flow temperatures, etc. So the interventions are around heat pumps, open source, ground source heat pumps, and sort of fifth generation heat loops, and sort of having a site-wide approach to it. So I think there was discussions on whether we could replace the glass with double glazing. I don't think that's come to fruition, but I think we are changing the the performance of the optics to better achieve solar gain, performance of the plant. So it's a site. The Palm House is one part of a much larger sort of master plan for Kew.
Yeah, it's a very interesting project because of the intrinsic value of the plants, and of course, in order to do the project, we have to empty the glass house. And they've done this every 50 odd years when they've done each refresh. And so we have to build a temporary glass house to put the plants into for the years that they'll be out of there. It takes 2 years to empty the glass house because they all have to be pruned and trimmed and all done at the right time. And so we're still going to be investing in some carbon while we do that before we can really make the big intervention. I mean, it's a fascinating project. And I think my observation from that project, it was really interesting that we assessed every single option and decision and choice with relation to carbon, because Kew have an ambition to be net zero carbon as a botanical garden. So it's a really strong part of their future. So every single decision had to be mapped, and it was not something that I've done before on a project. Every single option was considered. It was another variable in the mix against cost, practicality, affordability, and all those sorts of things. But it was, is it the right decision from a carbon perspective? And that, of course, has pulled out some really interesting dynamics and issues and challenges and opportunities.
I think one of the interesting bits on the curve is where you see the sort of the step across and the flat line. That's where we're using the temporary building, and it's much more efficient than the actual Palm House. So in an ideal world, you'd leave it all in the temporary building, but it's an iconic building, we can't do that. So.
And of course the temporary building, as its name is, the temporary, has to then have a future life as well. So we can't just send that to the scrapyard, so that then's got a future on the site, it's been used for other things. And so, there's this whole sort of string of reuse across the project, which is really exciting. I think we'll see much more of that project going forward. It's really, really exciting.
It's an interesting point though, isn't it? Would you not be better simply, in this instance, building a newer, fit-for-purpose glass house, because you're going to build one anyway in this case, and then find a different use for the... those are the sorts of really difficult discussions that actually need to happen, right? Yeah,
I think, if you were looking at with fresh eyes and you were saying, do we want to retain this, historic asset as a glass house at 30 degrees, or do we repurpose it to something else? So, interesting conversation to have with some of the stakeholders. But it might be something they do look at in 5-10 years time, where they where there is a carbon tax and they start paying £200-300 a tonne and start to realise how much it costs to operate the glass house. So that or ticket prices go up.
Where do you exactly draw the line of accountability? How much risk exactly are you willing to take as that advisory company? If for whatever reason something goes wrong, and speaking to Robin's firm, you end up under that curve for whatever reason.
I think there's so many parties involved in it. It is difficult for an MEP engineer, a client, an occupier, even the landlord to take responsibility for a fully net zero carbon building. I mean, we are seeing neighbours come in the UK, which is a more regulated look at ratings, energy performance. So those are sort of validated. They're then tested on site afterwards, and there is a breakdown of what's the landlord's responsibility, what's the the tenant's responsibility in terms of their energy use and how they're using it. So I think making sure the building is fit for purpose in terms of one of our key things we look at is the BMS control and energy metering. Actually understanding what your building's doing and where your energy's going is the first step to being able to control it. So one of the big things on neighbours, make sure you've got your metering strategy in place so that you can then identify, right, is it the landlord plant, is it the tenant plant? So the landlord will come back to the designers and say, you haven't achieved what we wanted you to. Conversely, if the tenant hasn't done what they were meant to do, then it will sit with them. So I think everyone's got skin in the game on who's responsible for it.
So are you seeing that split is relatively easy to achieve at that stage where we're at now? Obviously we're not at
I think it'll be interesting when we, when the real data becomes available and people start looking at it. I don't think we're there yet at the moment. I think, you know, even the industry starting with, you know, a net zero carbon building standard. So there's still a lot of work to do, you know, with CIBSE, REBA, Better Buildings Partnership. So the industry is coming together to define what net zero looks like as a proper standard. And that's, I mean, literally there was a call to action on it in the summer. The working groups for it have only started in the last week or so. And that's going to run through for the next, you know, few months to, I think, early next year, to look at actually defining under various work groups what net zero is and feed that into a larger piece. So, you know, the industry is still getting up to speed with what net zero means and how we achieve it, and, you know, what the metrics are. You know, we still work with the CREM metrics in terms of their reduction curves, or there's UKGBC for offices. There are still different metrics out there, so, you know, there's more to do, and, you know, more things to define, but we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's super important that it is about a journey and a dialogue. You know, it's very hard to say today when we're looking at trying to achieve something for 2050. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, let alone think about what might happen in 30 odd years' time. So it's a long time, but as long as the team is working together, communicating, understanding risk, reward, opportunity, consequence, you know, you can make sensible decisions, and you can plot a trajectory for the future, and those feedback loops will be super important. But we've got to do something today and then get the feedback rather than wait for feedback before we do something. We have to break the cycle and get the chicken before the egg, so to speak. But yeah, it's an incredibly challenging exercise to really get to these net zero buildings. But we have a good roadmap and we know what the elements of it are, which is really good. To the panel then, what's the actual market appetite for a retrofit building versus a new building? Are clients, tenants, owners, occupiers, you know, keen to have a refurbished asset, or are they still like the nice shiny sparkly glassy ones?
Retrofit, the recycle buildings, it might be just marketing kind of hot air, but it's better than new, because for all of the reasons that we've spoken about, there is so much carbon saved. So as long as it does everything that it needs to do, it provides a place that people want to be, I think it's as, if not more, desirable.
I mean, working in building performance, most of what I see is existing buildings and retrofitting, but there's certainly more appetite from clients looking at their building, of, you know, what they need to do to achieve net zero. And it is, you know, you've got office owners, you know, care home portfolio providers, farming sheds and things like that. So there's, you know, across the whole, you know, panoply of sectors with properties, everyone is looking at it, and it is partly due to the commitments that people have made, somewhat unknowingly, around we're going to be net zero carbon by 2025 or 2030. So they're, you know, starting to commission the studies to look at their buildings and what they need to do, and I think reality is catching up with some of their aspirations in terms of the magnitude of some of the changes they're going to have to meet. So it'll be an interesting couple of years, and there's some interesting discussions with clients around what they actually have to do and what it's going to mean for their business.
Yeah, Gemma, some final thoughts?
It feels like we're seeing more inquiries about retrofits and refurbishment, but I don't know that we're necessarily seeing a slowdown in new builds as well, which sort of implies still an increase in demand and consumption overall, so it's still not quite solving the problem.
Excellent. Dan, final words on it?
Yeah, I think it depends who you talk to. I mean, interestingly, at the moment we're seeing some of the investors and the banks being the most interested, because actually they're worried about liquidity in 3 or 4 years' time when you finish doing whatever you're going to do. I think it comes down to, if you can lease a building up well and you've got a good lease profile to a good covenant, then, you know, that will always generate the most value. Occupiers actually have always been, in my view, you know, they've been on board for quite a while with the idea that recycling a building is kind of a good idea, and actually there might be certain things that building can't do versus a new build, but, you know, you haven't put it all in the bin either, so that's a good thing. But I go back to my point where I think there is a big disconnect in the market. You know, I talked to a large occupier recently. They're advised by top-tier professionals across the board, and if I go to any of their State of the Nation presentations, I'll be bored to the back teeth of stuff about ESG and this, that, and the other. First question they ask me, how much power can we have? And you just want to go, you lot, you tell me how much power you absolutely need and how you're going to reduce it. Why don't we start there, rather than saying, if you've got 10% capacity, I absolutely need it. And it's that whole mindset, I think, from people that they're saying one thing, you know, tip box, shareholders, portfolios, blah, blah, blah. Actually, when it comes down to it, are they really making decisions that will get them to where they have told the world they're going to get to? And that's the bit I question. There's a kind of lot of, you know, it's a lot of education, but it's also just a change in mindset, I think, about what all of this stuff really means.
Fantastic, thank you. So we might conclude that retrofit is the new, but who knows? But I'd like you to just join me in thanking the panel for their observations and presentations. Thank you to the panel.